Women's Connection.
I'm Barrie-Louise Switzen.
Is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned? Welcome. We're going to talk about a subject that not many people like talking about. And I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about money. And with me is Carrie Coghill Martin, Certified Financial Planner, and I would like to welcome Carrie. Carrie, thank you for joining me.
It's a pleasure being here.
What makes talking about money so difficult versus sex?
Well, I think that the issue really is that people feel threatened when you start to talk about money, especially when couples come together, because in this day and age, people are getting married a lot later in life, and we have our life in place as far as what we like to spend our money on, how we spend our money, how we save our money. And I think when two people come together, what they find is that they feel that maybe it's their independence and the structure of their lives may be challenged. So it's a very difficult thing because we all have such different views about money.
Would you say it's harder for a woman to talk about money or a man to talk about money?
Well, I think it really depends on the people. If you're dealing with a woman that is successful in the business world or just has really taken their financial life and has it under control, then I think that the woman feels pressured, because I think men talk about money a lot more and a lot more openly, but in a very different way. They talk about it from a position of power, of strength, and women talk about money from a position of security. So the
big difference.
It's a huge difference. And it's not really, for us, for most of us anyway, it's not about, our money doesn't really create the image of who we are. And in many ways, for men, that's what they grow up believing and thinking, is that, getting their career under control and how their financial picture looks.
Do you find that it's changing? Women are becoming more open in some respects to talking about money than it was years ago?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of this problem really has stemmed from where we've come from. 50 years ago, the woman wasn't in the workplace. The woman was at home and the man took care of the money. That's just the way it is. So it's taken generations and will continue to take generations for women to really feel up to speed. I think that going forward, what we're probably going to find is that the next generation, I know that my daughter, who's 13, is growing up hearing and seeing on television commercials, whether it's about saving, investing, retirement, saving for college. So she's going to grow up really feeling a lot more comfortable than I did. And I came from one of these families where, my father went out and worked and took care of everything. So it's an education. This generation is really starting to become a lot more educated.
Well, I think they're more educated because of the internet. They can go exploring, they can find out information that's literally at their fingertips.
Yeah, and I think the main issue is that, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you went to work for a company, you stayed there forever.
Right.
Your company would take care of you, and that's changed dramatically. Really during the 80s, we saw this transition from pension plans to 401k plans to where now we are responsible for planning for our own retirement. So that's been one issue, and the other issue is that women are in the workplace now. So we have our own money.
Which is really great.
Yes.
Women are divorced from, let's see, what did my notes say? Women are divorced from husbands who help them accumulate and become very successful.
Mm-hmm.
Now you go back to, you're talking about a woman who 50 years ago was in the home. She was a housewife. She helped her husband succeed. And there was a very nasty divorce a few years back where the woman helped her husband, who was worked for a name company, the Fortune 100.
Yes.
And she got $40 million in the divorce settlement, if I'm correct. Going into a marriage, what should a woman of today consider?
I think that a woman has to consider these issues because of the divorce rate being so high. And if you and your spouse, these are things you need to discuss. If you and your spouse decide that when you have children that one of you, because it could be the man these days, or a woman is going to stay home with the child, you have to consider what would happen if the marriage didn't work out. Because it does, there are these instances, and I've seen them personally, where a woman that's home taking care of the house, taking care of the kids, and the marriage doesn't work out. So one of the things that we talk about in the book are prenuptial agreements. And going into the marriage, it's a very difficult thing, but it's something that, just based on the statistics, is really something that you need to address. So I think that that's one of the issues that women need to be aware of when they are getting married. And you know, you can do a postnuptial agreement, and I would recommend that if you're both in the business world and you decide that you want to stay home with the kids. You know, it's a tough subject to raise, but we do give some ideas on how you might approach it.
Because I know in your book, The Newlyweds Guide to Investing in Personal Finance, you've talked about a lot of these issues. And one of the things you talk, okay, so continuing on about the prenuptial and the postnuptial, what should a woman be aware of when she creates one?
Well, you need to be aware of what your life would look like if your husband wasn't there, for one reason or another. And it also gets into estate planning and how your estate plan should be set up. And I think one of the most challenging things for couples these days is that we enter into a marriage with other responsibilities. Sometimes we may have children. And if you're marrying someone that has children, or you have a child of your own, you need to consider what would happen, because you still need to be taken care of, even though those assets may go to your spouse's children at some point. So you always have to look at worst case scenario. And
Do you recommend commingling the funds?
that's a personal question amongst the two. I believe that if you have a very good prenuptial agreement in place, that prenuptial agreement will dictate whether or not it makes sense to commingle funds. I don't like to look at this subject from the negative. You know, let's not enter the marriage and plan for its demise. Let's do the best that we can possibly do to make it work, but also you have to have that plan in place in case it wouldn't. And truly, I think that the relationships that are the strongest financially are the ones where you really approach it from a team aspect. And what that means is communicating, really talking about, what do you want to do with your financial lives? You know, when do you want to retire? What kind of house do you want? How do you want to raise your kids? All of these things that will really dictate your future. And the issue of commingling funds, if you have a good prenuptial agreement in place, you really don't need to worry about it so much. And I think that, it helps the marriage if you're a lot more open about it. And that's why I really recommend it, because if you have it in place, you're going to breathe a little more easily and maybe be able to communicate better.
Do you find that the issues are the same for a first, second, or third marriage? Or they change?
Oh, they definitely change, because typically if it's a second marriage, one may have been burned.
What a surprise.
One or two may have children. And that's really the biggest challenge, is if you're building a life together and I'm planning with my spouse to retire at a certain age and he dies, and there are assets of his, then I need to make sure I still have access to them, and then eventually have them go to his kids once I pass on. But the communication issue is very important. That, along with just respecting each other's differences.
Now, how do you find financial harmony?
Well, harmony has to be viewed from the perspective of respect. And if I'm a saver and my spouse likes the better things in life, I have to respect that. This is something that's very personal. It's funny, you started with the, people talking about sex, and, I think everyone agrees that that's something that is very personal, and money is very personal too, and we have to respect that. We can't assume that our spouse is going to have the same views, and a lot of that just comes from, we're raised different. Our families really dictate that.
I was just going to say, everybody's got a different risk tolerance.
Yes.
How do you find your own individual risk tolerance and hope that they mesh?
We really have found that typically, just like couples go into therapy when they have differences, when people have very different views about money, about risk, working with a professional helps. working with someone that can really sit down and objectively point out what different risks are associated with different investments or budgeting forms, budgeting guidelines, I think that really helps to take the pressure off each other, because then you're battling. You know, it's just like my daughter. I have a tutor come help her with her homework, because if I try to help her, it's all my fault. You know, we're not going to see eye to eye. So working with someone that you trust, and there are also in the book, there's also an outline of how you would go about selecting someone, because that's not so easy either.
I can imagine. I hope to find out one day. Does it make sense to have two separate checking accounts?
The issue of checking accounts, once again, goes back to the couple and what they're accustomed to. For as crazy as it sounds, I think that many times these days it makes sense to have three.
Three?
So that
His, hers, and ours?
Yes, because that way people tend to maintain their independence.
Okay.
And that's very important. I think that's where we start to feel threatened with our money, is when our independence is taken away. And, you know, going forward, planning for your finances takes time, whether you're an individual, whether you're a couple, so you have to make it a priority. But a lot of times we find that if people have been accustomed to having their own checking account, it's difficult. And a lot of these issues with arguments over money comes from, well, you took money out and you didn't tell me, and I'm going to bounce a check, and, you know, I thought we had more money than this. But I think that full disclosure is very important too. I don't think you have your own checking account to hide. I think that you just, it's an issue of independence, it's an issue of responsibility. A lot of times if one person is responsible for paying the bills and balancing the checkbook, there could be resentment that builds up. So you want to be an active participant.
I remember it just came to me while you were talking about everybody having their own checkbook, going back to my mother's day. You know, the wife came home, stayed home, raised the children, and the husband always took care of the finances. And I remember one day my father went to work and left my mother without any cash, unbeknownst to him, and she was livid because she was home the whole day with no cash. And he said, but there's a checkbook. All you had to do was write a check. And
Yeah.
it was like, you know, the light bulb went off. It just never occurred to my mother to do something like that.
I think that we're all learning, and this idea of newlyweds and money, for some reason, I guess we just are so excited to get married, we really don't take the proper steps. So it was really a pleasure to write the book and help so many people, because a lot of these issues were issues I get every day from clients. You know, how many checking accounts should we have? How do we mesh our retirement plans? How do we mesh our investments?
Well, before you mesh them, how do you differentiate who pays what bills?
Well, that's, once again, that's the budgeting process, and people hate that word. Budgeting is like a four-letter word. But the thing to keep in mind is that the idea of a budget is not meant to be restrictive. It's meant to provide you with flexibility and make sure that you have the money to do the things you want. And I never judge people. You know, personally, my dining out expenses probably exceed my car payment, but that's okay, because there are other things that I don't spend money on. So I think that respect and really sitting down and having an idea, just an awareness of where you spend your money. And I think when people hear budget, they think, okay, I'm only allowed to spend this much money, but the
It's
awareness.
a frightening word.
Yes, and awareness is such a motivating issue. You know, if you see things you don't like, you're going to think twice.
What about mad money? Is that different than a checking account, or is it just mad money?
I think that it's important to get a gauge for how much mad money you're spending. And once again, I don't like to approach it from the position of, where is all this money going? I know myself personally, I keep a certain amount of money. I don't care where I spend it. I know somehow it's going to disappear, which is better than, I had a client that kept every single receipt to see where he was spending his money. You know, if he spent 60 cents on a pack of gum, he kept that receipt. And that's why people get frustrated.
I would.
So, you know, I don't think that you can be too hard on yourself, but yet you have to be comfortable, and you have to be sure that you're saving for the things that really matter long term. And you can never start saving. The younger, the sooner you start, the less the pressure you're going to have in reaching those goals. So, you know, I encourage everyone to really take a look at their finances, and especially women, because this is new for us, relatively speaking.
Very true, very true. Going back to your budget,
Yes.
you have a template that you have everybody work up. What are some of the key components of the template?
Well, we do in the template have fixed expenses and discretionary expenses. And there's always a line item for unforeseen expenses, and you know, we don't really want that to be, you know, shopping trips. We want that to be the furnace went and we need to replace it. But it just is to give people a feel for the different types of expenses that they have. When you get married, you still maintain individual expenses. So that's what's a little different about these budget templates, is that we do take into consideration that the husband may have fixed expenses such as car payment, cell phone. The wife may have her own fixed expenses. The other way that we approach this is just in having your longer term goals outlined. So if you're buying a starter home, what's your budget going to look like? If you take that starter home and you buy a big house, how potentially is that going to change how your budget looks? So what we're trying to do is to get people to think about the decisions that they're making and the long-term impact that's going to have on their money and really their retirement, whatever the goal is. Because we don't think about that. We are just keeping up with the Joneses. You know, 2 people, 2 cars, more money, bigger house. That's really not how you should be making your financial decisions. You should be thinking about what you truly want to get out of life with your money.
Retirement. Now, when should a person have joint assets? Like, when should it be joint or separate or not at all? Or
Well, you know, once again, a lot of that has to do, a person's assets and how they're titled really has to do with the comfort level that each person has going into the marriage, whether or not they have a prenuptial agreement just in case. A lot of people don't mind having joint assets, and they just view it as though if something were to happen, they would split those accounts. The issue that you need to be aware of is that typically with a joint account, one person has complete access over it, so they could drain all of the assets out.
That's not good.
So, you know, you need to be aware of those things, but there really is no written rule about that. It really has more to do just with the comfort level of the individuals. A lot of people jointly title everything. I mean, that's more the norm than just keeping assets separate. The other issue is just the complications that may exist in the marriage. People that are getting married for the second time, third time, you know, they may keep their assets separate because they've either accumulated more or for estate planning purposes, it's necessary. Once you hit a certain level of an asset base, for estate planning purposes, people do the reverse and separate their assets in order to take advantage of certain estate planning techniques.
oh, interesting.
So, and that's a whole nother show.
Okay. Should a woman maintain credit cards in her own name?
Yes. I think
Okay.
that, you know, you always want to have the ability to get credit should you need credit. And that's not only in case of divorce, it would be in case your spouse dies.
What legal papers should a woman make sure she has?
Aside from the prenuptial agreement.
Right.
Which, you know, and I have to tell you, I just recently went through this, and it's not easy. And I'm aware of all these things. It's still not easy. So the prenuptial agreement is important, but when people marry, they need to have a power of attorney, which is extremely important. So I wouldn't, as a woman, I wouldn't just jump to the conclusion that my spouse should be my power of attorney. It depends a lot on the strength of the relationship. A power of attorney is the person that will make all of your decisions for you, financial decisions, if you're incapacitated. So you may choose to have a sister, a mother, a relative be your power of attorney instead of your spouse. There's also a health care directive, which is a living will that would state whether or not you want life support if you were ill, and you name a person to that. So, you know, in the back, you know, when my parents were doing all of this, it was just automatic because the man really took care of everything. But we have options these days.
Today is everything has changed.
It has
and the laws have changed, and people are getting second and third marriages.
Right, and you might
So-
even consider having two people act as your power of attorney, that they have to agree to make these decisions. So it depends on the relationship.
Now, what about common law marriages? Is there still such a thing?
Yes,
And-
there is.
All right. And what is the normal age range? Not age
It's
range, the length, I think it's 7 years? It's still 7
right,
years, okay.
Right, and there's a list in the book of which states fall into that. And then what you have is a situation of equitable distribution. So if you were to separate, you're in the same situation as far as how your assets would be distributed. And it's very important to understand what you're entitled to under the law in your state, because you may be surprised that, you know, part of the estate you may be entitled to a different percentage upon death. For instance, in the state of Pennsylvania, where I'm from, it's a third.
Oh, interesting.
It's not half, it's a third.
Well, let's say the person says, okay, after 8 years you've been living with this person, and they said, sorry, it's all over. Is that considered a common law marriage? And if so, what are you entitled to?
Yes, it's considered a common law marriage, and in that case, what would happen is that the one party would sue the other person for what they feel is rightfully theirs, and that would generally, in those states, fall under what the law states for married couples.
Now, there's a tax cut that's in effect. But from what I've been reading, that the tax cut reverts back to its normal base in 2010.
2011.
Oh, 2011,
Yes.
okay. So what should we be aware of today for what's happening down the road?
It makes it very challenging
Okay.
to do your financial planning under current tax laws, knowing that they potentially may change back. How we've been approaching it is just assuming that they're not here, and that we do our financial planning based on the laws that were in force last year, 2001, because that's what they'll revert back to. So
okay.
worst case scenario, when you're doing your financial planning, you really should always try to use worst case scenario, or at least something that's realistic. I think a lot of people got caught with that with the stock market over the last couple of years, where they thought,
Oh,
well,
yes.
if I get 20% a year, I can retire in 5 years. And now they're saying, okay, that's not going to happen.
If you get 3%, you're happy.
Right, right. It's amazing how things change. But the tax laws were very positive in terms of estate issues, in terms of saving for college education. And I really believe that some of these laws will stick. And there will be some benefit over what we had in 2001. So we've already started to see some interesting developments proposing that some of these laws are enforced permanently.
What would you say going forward women should be aware of?
Well, I think women need to really take their financial well-being into their own hands. You would think that in this day and age, we would be thinking like this. But, I have a lot of friends that have put their lives on hold because they're waiting to meet Mr. Right, or, they're waiting for something to change in their lives. And I think you have to approach that from an issue of, if that happens, it's nice, but you should never be in a position that you can't be happy financially, that you're not living beyond your means. And you see that happen where you're married and you're living well beyond your means and not really prepared if something were to happen to your spouse, whether it be death or divorce. And death you can plan for in terms of life insurance. Divorce is very challenging. So I think that women just need to take control of their money and be aware. It's all about creating an awareness of how much money's coming in, how much is going out, and are you doing the right things to make sure that you get what you want out of life. That's really what this is all about.
What periodicals would you suggest women read?
Well, I think the Wall Street Journal is great because there's an awful lot of media hype out there. And you have to be careful. Even of times you get people out there with an axe to grind. If you ask if you ask a stock manager
Right.
what's going to go on with the stock market, They're going to give you the reasons why and when it's going to recover. So, you know, and I think that CNBC has gotten a lot better at how to ask their analysts, well, do you own this stock? Or does your firm own this stock?
I think that's all changed since the Enron fiasco.
It definitely has. So you really need to read. You know, the USA Today actually has a very easy to read money page. But I think that ultimately it makes sense to work with a professional in some capacity. I mean, even if you have someone that you meet with once a year and they're charging you hourly just to say, hey, am I doing the right things? It probably makes a lot of sense because it's a lot of information and these things change every day.
It's like information overload.
It really is. It really is. And I don't think any of us would take our health issues into our own hands. You know, these things that are so critically important to our lives, but yet people have felt that they've been able to take their financial life into their own hands. And unfortunately, many people have learned a really tough lesson over the last couple of years.
True. In the closing moments of the show, Carrie, what would you like to leave the audience with?
I would just like to say that, you know, taking control over your money, it's not a bad thing. It's not meant to be restrictive. It's not meant to prevent you from getting everything you want out of life. It's really designed to allow you to do the things you want. And sometimes we just get so wrapped up in, you know, what's my investment return, and am I making enough money? Stay focused on what it is you want out of life, not what everyone else wants.
That's true. Carrie, thank you so much for joining me.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
And are you taking care of your financial health? Love to hear from you. And thank you for joining us. Bye now.